War. In the summer of 1914, the world was set ablaze. Europe's greatest empires, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, France, and Britain, marched their millions into a conflict unlike anything humanity had ever seen. Machine guns ripped apart battle lines. Artillery thundered across fields. Soldiers dug into the earth, creating miles upon miles of trenches where mud, blood, and fear became daily companions. The Great War had begun. But across the Atlantic Ocean, in the United States of America, life went on. The horrors of the Western Front seemed distant. Americans read about the carnage in newspapers, saw photographs of ruined towns and shell-shocked men. Yet for most, it was still Europe's tragedy, not theirs. And in those early years, the United States stood apart. Neutral, watching, waiting. This is the story of how America stayed out, why it was eventually pulled in, and how its entry turned the tide of World War I. It's the story of divided loyalties, political battles, economic interests, and, ultimately, a nation forced onto the world stage. This is the history of America's role in the First World War. Welcome to the channel. If you love history told with emotion, depth, and meaning, you're in the right place. Today, we'll explore not just what happened, but why it mattered and how it changed America forever. Let's begin. When war first erupted in 1914, President Woodrow Wilson addressed the nation with calm but firm words. The United States, he declared, would remain impartial in thought as well as in action. Neutrality, Wilson insisted, was the only path forward. And at first glance, neutrality made sense. The U.S. Army was small, barely ranking among the world's great powers. The nation was focused inward on growth, industry, and progress. Why should American sons be sent to die in Europe's trenches? But neutrality was easier said than lived. Beneath the surface, America was a nation of immigrants. And those immigrants carried the memories, loyalties, and rivalries of the old world. German Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, and countless others brought their passions into the debate. German communities sympathized with the Kaiser's cause, or at the very least opposed aiding Britain. Irish Americans remembered centuries of British oppression and recoiled at the idea of supporting the empire that still ruled their homeland. Meanwhile, Americans of English and French descent leaned heavily toward the Allies, their cultural ties and sympathies pulling them toward Britain and France. This was a divided America, and Wilson's plea for impartiality was quickly tested by business, by propaganda, and by blood. American companies saw opportunity in war. Though officially neutral, U.S. banks and industries began trading heavily with the Allies. Britain's navy ruled the seas, which meant that shipping to Germany was nearly impossible. So, over time, American goods, wheat, steel, ammunition, uniforms, flowed in massive quantities to Britain and France. Wall Street bankers lent billions to the Allied cause. Neutrality was written in speeches, but dollars and ships told another story. Across the ocean, Britain understood the power of American opinion. British propaganda painted Germany as the aggressor, a militaristic empire bent on conquest. Stories of atrocities in Belgium, some true, others exaggerated, filled American newspapers. Germany, the Hun, was portrayed as barbaric, ruthless, inhumane. These images sank deep into the American imagination. Germany, for its part, did little to soften its image. In 1915, German submarines, the deadly U-boats, began targeting ships in the Atlantic. They claimed it was necessary to choke off Britain's supplies. But one infamous attack changed everything. On May 7, 1915, the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland. Nearly 1,200 people died, including 128 Americans. Shock and fury swept the United States. Newspapers roared with outrage. Wilson condemned the attack but resisted calls for war. He demanded Germany curb its submarine campaign. For a time, Germany backed down, aware that pushing the U.S. too far could be dangerous. Yet the seeds of anger had been planted. America was not yet ready for war, but it was no longer truly neutral. Meanwhile, the debate raged at home. Many Americans argued passionately against involvement. The anti-war movement pointed to the oceans, natural shields separating America from Europe's madness. Progressives worried that war would crush reform movements, silencing the fight for workers' rights and women's suffrage. Parents feared losing their sons to muddy graves overseas. Why should Americans die for Europe's quarrels? They asked. But others saw war as inevitable, even necessary. Business leaders counted the profits of Allied trade and knew an Allied defeat could cripple the American economy. Intellectuals and politicians warned that a world dominated by German militarism would threaten democracy everywhere. And hawks insisted that America's honor demanded a response to Germany's provocations. Through it all, Wilson clung to neutrality. He even won re-election in 1916 with the slogan, "He kept us out of war." For a time, that promise held. America stood apart, torn between peace and war, profit and principle, fear and pride. But across the Atlantic, events were already unfolding that would make neutrality impossible. The oceans, once thought to protect America, became the very reason it was dragged into the fight. This section covers unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and the final push into war. By early 1917, Europe's war showed no signs of ending. The trenches stretched endlessly across France, and millions were already dead. The Allies bled, the Central Powers strained, and both sides looked for a decisive blow. For Germany, that blow would come from beneath the waves. German admirals argued that only unrestricted submarine warfare could starve Britain into submission. No ship, military or civilian, neutral or enemy, would be safe in the waters around the British Isles. It was a desperate gamble. They knew it would anger America, perhaps even bring the United States into the war. But they also believed Britain would collapse before America could make a difference. So, in January 1917, Germany announced that unrestricted submarine warfare would resume. Within weeks, U-boats began sinking American ships. One after another, freighters, tankers, and merchant vessels vanished beneath the waves, their crews lost to the cold Atlantic. Wilson, who had long clung to peace, now saw Germany's actions as a direct challenge to American sovereignty. Neutrality was being torn apart, ship by ship, sailor by sailor. And then came the telegram. In March 1917, American newspapers published a shocking revelation. The British had intercepted a secret German message sent by Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to Mexico. The Zimmermann telegram proposed an alliance. If the United States entered the war against Germany, Mexico should attack America's southern border. In return, Germany promised Mexico the return of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The news exploded across the nation. Though some doubted its authenticity at first, Germany soon admitted the telegram was real. The idea that Germany would conspire to incite war on American soil shattered any remaining illusions. The combination of sunken ships and the Zimmermann plot pushed public opinion past the breaking point. Neutrality was no longer possible. In April 1917, President Wilson stood before Congress with solemn determination. His voice carried the weight of history as he declared, "The world must be made safe for democracy." With those words, he asked for a declaration of war against Germany. On April 6th, Congress voted in favor, and the United States entered World War I. America had crossed the line. After nearly 3 years of watching from the sidelines, the nation now marched into the greatest conflict the modern world had ever known. But entering the war was only the beginning. For a country with a small standing army and little preparation for global conflict, the challenge ahead was immense. Mobilization became America's first great test. The Selective Service Act of 1917 introduced the draft, and millions of young men registered for service. Posters covered city walls, Uncle Sam pointing his finger, "I want you for U.S. Army." Communities watched their sons depart for training camps, uncertain if they would ever return. In towns and cities, parades sent off regiments to the sound of drums and cheers. But behind the celebrations lingered fear and grief. The scale of mobilization was staggering. Factories shifted overnight from peacetime production to the machinery of war. Automobiles gave way to tanks, plows to artillery, textiles to uniforms. Women entered the workforce in greater numbers than ever before, filling jobs left vacant by men gone to the front. The government launched massive campaigns to encourage rationing, war bond purchases, and support for the troops. "Food will win the war," proclaimed posters urging Americans to conserve wheat and meat. Liberty bonds became a symbol of patriotism, with families across the country investing their savings in the war effort. Yet not all Americans supported the war. The draft was controversial, sparking protests and even riots. Pacifists, socialists, and labor leaders spoke out against what they saw as a war for profit, fought by the poor while the wealthy prospered. The government responded harshly. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 gave authorities sweeping power to silence dissent. Newspapers were censored. Critics were jailed. The promise of liberty, many argued, was sacrificed in the name of war. Still, the machine of mobilization pressed forward. By late 1917, American soldiers, known as the Doughboys, began crossing the Atlantic in convoys protected from U-boat attack by destroyers and depth charges. They arrived in France with energy, determination, and a sense of destiny. The Allies welcomed them as saviors, fresh troops to replace their exhausted armies. The sight of American flags unfurling on European soil lifted morale across the front. For Germany, the clock was now ticking. They knew that once American forces arrived in strength, the balance of the war would shift irreversibly. Desperate, they launched one last great offensive in the spring of 1918, pouring troops and artillery into massive assaults on the Western Front. The German army surged forward, reaching within striking distance of Paris. The Allies staggered under the onslaught. For a moment, victory seemed possible for Germany. But then the Americans arrived. This section focuses on America's combat role in France, Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, Meuse-Argonne, and life on the home front. The summer of 1918 became the true test of American strength. Fresh from training camps, inexperienced but full of energy, U.S. troops entered the crucible of the Western Front. Their baptism of fire came at a place called Belleau Wood. In June 1918, German forces pushed dangerously close to Paris. The French, battered and desperate, pleaded for American support. The U.S. Marines, alongside Army units, moved into position near the Marne River. For 3 weeks, the woods echoed with gunfire, artillery blasts, and desperate charges. The Germans expected to sweep aside these untested Americans. Instead, they met ferocious resistance. At Belleau Wood, the Marines earned their reputation for tenacity. Through gas attacks, machine gun nests, and relentless counterattacks, they held firm. One officer shouted to his men, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here." Those words became legend. When the smoke cleared, the Americans had driven the Germans back. The victory electrified the Allies and sent a chilling message to Germany. America had arrived, and it would not be broken. From Belleau Wood onward, American forces surged into the fight. By September 1918, more than 1 million U.S. soldiers were in France, organized under the command of General John J. Pershing. Pershing insisted that American units fight as an independent army, not simply as reinforcements for Britain and France. His goal was clear. America would prove itself as a decisive force. Their first major independent operation came at St. Mihiel. In a bold offensive, American troops attacked a German-held salient that had resisted Allied assaults for years. With precise coordination, overwhelming artillery, and sheer determination, the doughboys smashed through. In just a few days, the St. Mihiel salient collapsed, and tens of thousands of German prisoners were taken. It was a stunning victory, proof that America could plan and execute large-scale operations on its own. But the true test still lay ahead: the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. Launched in late September 1918, the Meuse-Argonne was the largest operation ever undertaken by the American Expeditionary Forces. More than 1.2 million U.S. soldiers took part. Their objective: break through the heavily fortified German lines and force the enemy into retreat. The terrain was brutal: thick forests, rolling hills, and mud that swallowed men whole. German defenses were formidable, with barbed wire, trenches, machine guns, and artillery waiting for any advance. The fighting was relentless. Day after day, Americans pushed forward under withering fire. Casualties mounted. Entire units were cut down in minutes. The Argonne became a place of agony, but also of extraordinary heroism. The Lost Battalion, surrounded by Germans for days, refused to surrender, holding out until relief finally arrived. Sergeant Alvin York, a humble farmer from Tennessee, single-handedly captured more than 100 German soldiers, becoming one of the most celebrated heroes of the war. Slowly, painfully, the Americans advanced. By November, their relentless assault broke the German defenses. Exhausted, starving, and facing collapse at home, Germany's armies began to crumble. The arrival of millions of fresh American troops had tipped the balance. What the Allies could not achieve in 3 years of slaughter, America's entry accomplished in just over a year. Back home, the war effort transformed American society. Cities buzzed with activity as factories ran day and night. Women filled assembly lines, producing rifles, shells, and uniforms. The suffrage movement gained momentum as women's contributions to the war could no longer be ignored. African Americans, too, played a vital role, migrating in huge numbers from the rural South to northern cities to work in war industries, a movement known as the Great Migration. Yet they also faced discrimination and segregation, both at home and in the military. Propaganda filled the streets. The Committee on Public Information, led by George Creel, unleashed a flood of posters, films, and rallies designed to rally support. Artists painted stirring images of soldiers charging into battle, of Lady Liberty calling for aid, of sinister German figures threatening innocent women and children. 4-Minute Men gave speeches in theaters and town squares, stirring patriotism in the hearts of millions. The war was not just fought overseas. It was fought in American minds and homes. At the same time, suspicion and fear gripped the nation. German Americans, once proud of their heritage, now faced hostility. Sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. Schools banned German language classes. Neighbors watched each other with suspicion, fearing spies and saboteurs. For some, patriotism became a license for persecution. Yet through all the turmoil, the nation held together. War bonds were bought, food was conserved, and communities rallied behind their soldiers. America, once divided by ethnic loyalties and debates over neutrality, now marched in unison toward victory. And that victory came swiftly. By November 1918, the German army was collapsing, its allies falling away, its people starving. On the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the guns finally fell silent. The armistice was signed. The Great War was over. For the soldiers in the trenches, the silence was surreal. After years of thunderous artillery and endless death, the stillness felt unreal. Men wept, laughed, and embraced. Some stood in stunned silence, unable to believe it was truly finished. Across the Atlantic, bells rang, flags waved, and celebrations erupted in every American city. The war to end all wars had ended, or so people hoped. But the end of fighting was not the end of struggle. For America, the real test was just beginning, shaping the peace and defining its place in the world. This section focuses on Wilson's vision of Versailles, the League of Nations fight, America's retreat into isolation, and the long-term legacy of WI for the United States. The war was over, but the peace was still to be won. In January 1919, President Woodrow Wilson sailed across the Atlantic, becoming the first sitting American president to travel to Europe. Crowds filled the streets of Paris to greet him. To many, he was not just a leader, but a prophet, the man who promised to create a new world order, one built not on conquest or revenge, but on cooperation and peace. Wilson's vision was captured in his 14 points. Freedom of the seas, reduction of armaments, national self-determination, and above all, a League of Nations, an international body that would resolve disputes and prevent future wars. He believed America's entry into the war was not only to defeat Germany, but to give birth to a lasting peace, a peace unlike any the world had ever seen. But the reality of Versailles was harsher. France and Britain, bled dry by years of slaughter, wanted revenge. French leader Georges Clemenceau demanded security against future German aggression. Britain's David Lloyd George sought to balance punishment with pragmatism. The Allies wanted Germany to pay reparations, to be stripped of territory, to bear the blame for the war. Wilson fought to keep the treaty aligned with his principles, but compromise was inevitable. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed crushing penalties on Germany, billions in reparations, severe military restrictions, and the infamous war guilt clause. To Wilson's dismay, the treaty bore the marks of vengeance more than justice. Yet he clung to one triumph. The League of Nations was created. To him, the League was the key. Whatever flaws existed in the treaty could be corrected through international cooperation. If nations could meet, discuss, and compromise, war could be prevented. That was his dream. But back home in the United States, the dream unraveled. The Senate bristled at the Treaty of Versailles. Many senators, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, opposed the League of Nations, fearing it would entangle America in endless foreign wars. The Constitution gave Congress the power to declare war, but would the League override that? Would American soldiers be sent to fight at the command of distant nations? For isolationists, the League was a betrayal of American independence. For others, the treaty itself was unacceptable, too harsh on Germany, too full of compromises. Wilson, stubborn and idealistic, refused to bend. He toured the nation, giving passionate speeches, trying to rally public opinion behind the League. Crowds cheered, but opposition in Washington remained fierce. Exhausted, Wilson collapsed during the tour. A severe stroke left him incapacitated for the rest of his presidency. The fight for the League was lost. In 1920, the Senate rejected the Treaty of Versailles. America would not join the League of Nations. For Wilson, it was a bitter defeat. He had dreamed of making the world safe for democracy, of leading humanity into a new era of peace. Instead, America retreated inward, choosing isolation over engagement. The nation turned its focus back to prosperity, industry, and the promise of the roaring 1920s. Yet the legacy of the war lingered. Nearly 120,000 Americans had died in the conflict. Another 200,000 were wounded. Their lives forever changed. The war had tested the nation's unity, expanded the role of government, and redefined America's place on the world stage. The impact on society was profound. Women, having proven their abilities in factories, offices, and even in volunteer corps overseas, gained new momentum in their fight for the vote. In 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, granting women's suffrage nationwide. African Americans, though often relegated to segregated units in the military, had fought bravely in France. Many returned determined to demand equality, sparking movements that would echo throughout the century. Culturally, the war reshaped American memory. Monuments rose in towns and cities, honoring the fallen. Veterans groups formed, keeping alive the bonds of comradeship forged in the trenches. Armistice Day, November 11th, became a solemn reminder of sacrifice, a day of silence for those who never returned. But there was also disillusionment. The lofty promises of Wilson's speeches seemed hollow in the face of the harsh Versailles settlement and America's refusal to join the League. Writers, poets, and artists who lived through the war expressed a sense of loss. A lost generation adrift in a world that had seen the worst of human destruction. For many Americans, World War I was both a triumph and a warning. The nation had risen to the occasion, tipped the balance, and emerged as a global power. Yet it had also seen the dangers of foreign entanglements, the costs of intervention, and the limits of idealism. These lessons would shape American policy for decades to come. In the end, America's role in World War I was a paradox. The United States entered late, but decisively. It claimed to fight for peace, yet left behind a treaty that sowed the seeds of future conflict. It emerged as a world leader, yet chose isolation. And when the guns fell silent in 1918, Americans believed they had fought the war to end all wars. But history would prove otherwise. Barely 2 decades later, the world would once again be engulfed in flames, and America would once again be called upon to fight. This section ties everything together with closing reflections. The story of America in the First World War is a story of hesitation, of conviction, and of transformation. For nearly 3 years, the nation clung to neutrality, wary of entanglements in Europe's blood-soaked fields. But when the tide of war threatened its honor, its economy, and its security, America could not remain apart. The entry of the United States into the war was not just about soldiers and battles. It was about the emergence of a new identity. For the first time, America fought not only for itself, but for the idea that its values could shape the wider world. Wilson's words, "The world must be made safe for democracy," captured both the idealism and the burden of America's role on the global stage. On the battlefield, the doughboys proved themselves in places like Belleau Wood, Saint-Mihiel, and the Argonne, fighting with determination and courage that shocked even hardened European veterans. At home, families sacrificed, workers toiled, women and men alike stepped into new roles to keep the nation moving. The entire country, from its smallest towns to its largest cities, became part of the war effort. But the legacy of World War I is complicated. The victory was real, yet incomplete. The ideals were noble, yet fragile. The sacrifices were immense, yet soon overshadowed by the failures of the peace. America emerged more powerful than ever, yet chose to retreat inward, leaving the world to grapple with the consequences. Still, the war changed America forever. It marked the moment the United States stepped out of the shadows and onto the world stage. It was the beginning of a century in which American influence, for better or worse, would shape global events. The lessons of the First World War, its triumphs and its tragedies, would echo in the choices of generations to come. And today, more than 100 years later, the names of those battles, the faces of those soldiers, the voices of leaders long gone, still remind us of the costs of war and the fragile hope of peace. America's role in World War I was not just about ending a conflict. It was about defining a destiny. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it helped you see the past in a new light, don't let it end here. Tap that like button to help more people discover these untold chapters of our history. Share your thoughts in the comments. What lessons do you think America truly learned from World War I? And if you want more stories like this, Subscribe and join us as we bring history to life, one episode at a time. Until next time, remember, history is never just about the past. It's about who we are and who we choose to become.